Let's start. Okay, today's daf is Ayin Hey. We're going to start in the new Mishnah, and Be'ezrat Hashem we'll get to the end of the parak today. So Shetei Chatzerot Zo Lifnei Mizo. You have two Chatzerot, one is inside the other. So we've actually seen this case several times. It came up already in Masekhet Eruvin a few times. So the situation is you have, what it means by Zo Lifnei Mizo is that one Chatzer, one courtyard spills out into an outer courtyard. So in other words, if you live in the inner courtyard, the only way out is through this outer courtyard. So the people who live in the inner courtyard have to go out through the outer courtyard. The people in the outer courtyard don't have any need to go into the inner courtyard necessarily. They can go straight out of their development. So the possibilities here are endless. Okay, so ereva hapenimit v'lo ereva chitzona. So if the inner chatzer, now each chatzer has its own obligation of eruvei chatzerot, right? Because each one has its own group, and they're not necessarily connected. So the inner courtyard can make an eruv, but the outer courtyard didn't make an eruv. So then what will happen? The inner courtyard is fine. They have an eruv. The outer courtyard is prohibited because they don't have an eruv. Now, the fact that the outer courtyard is prohibited doesn't affect the inner courtyard, because the inner courtyard, the people in the outer courtyard don't have to come into the inner courtyard. It's only the other way around. Oh, you have a picture? Okay. No. That's the other case of the three houses. Yeah. So no, this is the case. It's simpler to envision. I mean, it's just that you live in a dead end, and you have to come out through another street. So it's almost like your courtyard opens to another courtyard. That courtyard is how you get into the street. Okay. All right. So the outer courtyard doesn't have to pass through another courtyard. So its status doesn't affect the inner courtyard. Mm-hmm. Because the outer courtyard will just go out. But the inner courtyard people have to pass through the outer courtyard. Right. All right, so if the inner courtyard has an eruvei chatzerot, but the outer courtyard does not, so then that only affects the outer courtyard. Okay? Now, what happens if... So if the outer courtyard makes an eruv but the inner one does not, shtehen asurot. So then what happens is they're both prohibited. Why? Because the outer courtyard did a very good job. They made their own eruvei chatzerot, but the only problem is that the inner courtyard did not. And the inner courtyard affects the outer courtyard, because the people in the inner courtyard are going to walk through. They have what's called dirisat regel. They walk through the outer courtyard to get out. So in a way, they have rights to the outer courtyard as well. So since the inner courtyard people did not make an eruvei chatzerot, their status of prohibition that they cannot carry in their own courtyard now because they didn't make an eruv it spills over onto the outer courtyard. Okay, so it's unidirectional. It only works that if the inner courtyard people didn't make an eruv, that messes things up for the outer courtyard, because the inner courtyard people have to walk through the outer courtyard.
What's eruvei chatzerot?
Okay, eruvei chatzerot is that if you have multiple houses that share a courtyard, they share an enclosed, big yard, so they have to join together with bread. They put the bread in one of the houses, because otherwise it's similar to a public area. You can't carry from a private to a public area, but that's really defined as enclosure. So the only problem is that if you have a courtyard that's enclosed, but it still feels like a public domain because it's shared by multiple houses.
Is this because of the size of it?
No, just because since it has multiple owners, right, multiple owners, multiple usage. So multi-usage makes it seem like a public domain. So that's why the rabbis made a rule, they have to make an eruvei chatzerot. So the question, now you have adjoining courtyards. So each of them makes one independently. The residents of one courtyard make their own. The residents of another courtyard make their own. But these courtyards have an interesting relationship, because you have one that faces directly onto the public domain, and the other one that its exit is into the other courtyard first, and then it goes to the out. So their status is going to affect the outer courtyard too. So now the Mishnah says that let's say each one made its own independent eruv. So what's the rule then? So the inner courtyard the people who live in the inner courtyard can carry in their own courtyard, and the people who live in the outer courtyard can carry in their own courtyard, but they didn't make an eruv with one another. Right? They didn't connect their two courtyards. So that means that they can't carry, let's say, from courtyard A to courtyard B. So zob muteret b'fnei atzma, v'zob muteret b'fnei atzma. So each one is going to be permitted in its own domain. And what's the chidush here? What's the novel idea here? That even though the people in the inner courtyard are going to walk through the outer courtyard, right, when they go out, that doesn't mean that they have to absolutely join, that the two courtyards have to join to be one. Because you might think, well, after all, the inner courtyard people can't carry things from their courtyard into the outer courtyard, because they didn't join, they didn't merge with the outer courtyard. So maybe the fact that they're walking through the outer courtyard should be a problem, because people who can't carry into that courtyard are walking through it, so and sharing it in a certain way. So the chidush is that doesn't affect it. Now, but Rabbi Akiva osera chitzona shederisat regel osarta. However, Rabbi Akiva is the one who says no, that's not true. Since these two courtyards are not merged, they each have their own eruvei chatzerot. So Chatzer A has its own, and Chatzer B has its own, but they're not united. And the people in Chatzer B walk out through Chatzer A. The fact that they walk out through Chatzer A means that they have a share in Chatzer A, because they have rights to it, because they're going to walk through it. That means that they ruin it for the outer courtyard, according to Rabbi Akiva. So this is a machloket. In a case where you have a situation where each courtyard in and of itself is perfectly fine. Okay, they made an eruv in A and they made an eruv in B. The people in B walk out through A. So according to Rabbi Akiva, the fact that they walk out through A means that they must join the two courtyards in order for the people in the outer courtyard to be able to carry anything. Must.
Single eruv.
Right, they must have a single eruv. Because since the inner courtyard is using the outer courtyard, in other words, they have certain rights to it, they must merge. Chachamim say, no. As long as each courtyard in and of itself is good, the fact that the inner courtyard people walk through the outer courtyard doesn't affect anything. That's not a problem. Chachamim say that walking out doesn't affect the outer courtyard. Okay, so we're going to see more about this in the Gemara.
But if the inner people did not make an error,
then they would affect the outer.
Then that would affect. Mm-hmm. Why is that? I mean, it seems counterintuitive.
Yeah, it is a little bit counterintuitive. But since Eruvei Chatzerot is really primarily dealing with carrying of objects, in other words, moving objects from houses into courtyard and from courtyard to courtyard. So when the people in the inner courtyard, that area is a restricted area insofar as carrying is concerned. So that status extends to the entire area. When the people in their own area can carry, the inner courtyard is the key piece. When they can carry in their own domain, so now they're not considered in a state of prohibition. They're permitted in their own domain, so they can walk out through the outer courtyard. You're right.
It's not just carrying, it's also walking.
Well, no, because walking, they're allowed to walk out.
They're allowed, if
you can walk in the street.
If the inner courtyard has no error,
they can still walk.
They can walk through.
They can walk through the outer courtyard. They just can't carry anything. Just like you can walk on the street. So the question is walking significant, since walking, after all, doesn't have any restriction on it. Okay?
The people who front on A no longer can carry in A because of B.
Because of B, exactly. Even though they did their duty of making an eruv, the people inside can't carry, so that status of not being able to carry ruins it for everyone. Right. Pretty much.
So it's viewed as a single unit that can be subdivided, but if any part of it fails...
Well, if the inner part fails. The inner part is the defining part, right. So if that part fails, it's no good, because those people are prohibited in carrying, and that affects everybody, because they also have a share in the outer courtyard. So their prohibited status basically spills over to the outer courtyard. Right? Even though what they're doing in the outer courtyard is just walking, which itself is permitted. So now we say shachach echad. So what happens if the shachach echad min hachitzona v'lo erev hapenimit muteret v'chitzona asura? Okay, so if one person in the outer courtyard forgets to do an eruv, that ruins it for the outer courtyard, but the inner courtyard is still good, because the outer doesn't ruin the inner, it's only the other way. If somebody from the inner courtyard forgets, we actually learned this earlier a couple of dapim ago. If somebody in the inner courtyard forgets, that means the inner courtyard, their eruv failed. So since the inner courtyard's eruv failed, everybody loses. Okay? Now, natnu eruvan b'makom echad v'shachach echad ben min ha'penimit ben min hachitzona v'lo erev shetehen asurot. So it says if they put the eruv, in other words, they have to place it. So now we're talking in the last case about where they merged the chatzerot. Everybody joined together. Okay? Everyone joins together, and they put the Eruv in one of the two places, but it doesn't tell us which of the two places. It's going to tell us in the Gemara. So, they put it in one of two places. If anybody failed to join the Eruv, whether the outer or the inner, the whole thing is going to fall apart. Okay, we're going to find out under what case that's true. If it was of Yechidim, of one person, in other words, if only one person lives in the courtyard in the inside, and only one person lives in the courtyard in the outside, then it's no problem. They don't need an eruv. Why not? Because one person who has a courtyard all to themselves doesn't have to make an eruv. It's a single owner. And the fact that since he doesn't have an obligation of eruv, he has no status that he's going to affect the guy on the outside when he walks out of his area. So even though he still has to traverse, let's say, the courtyard that belongs to the other guy, when he leaves, there's no obligation of eruv chatzerot in either eruv, because both of them are in either courtyard, because both courtyards are independently owned.
So if there are multiple owners in the outer courtyard and only one owner on the inner, that person on the inner can't affect the status.
Yeah, but that case actually comes up in the Gemara. So hold on to that thought. But yeah, that case comes up. But you're right. In principle, you're right. Okay, so the Gemara says, "Ki ata Rav Dimi." When Rav Dimi came from Israel, Amar Rabbi Yanai, he said in the name of Rabbi Yanai, "Zod divrei Rabbi Akiva damar filo regel muter b'mkoma useret shelo b'mkoma." That this whole Mishnah is coming from the perspective of Rabbi Akiva. Rabbi Akiva says that afilu regel muteret bimkoma oseret shelo bimkoma, that even somebody whose leg is permitted, literally that means, in other words, he has freedom of motion in his own domain. So the people in the inner courtyard have their own chatzer, have their own eruvei chatzerot, but they didn't merge with the outer courtyard. That even though they're allowed to carry in their own courtyard, they still ruin it for the outer courtyard, according to Rabbi Akiva. The Chachamim, though, according to Rabbi Yanai, represent an even more radical opinion, an opinion we haven't even seen yet, which is, even if, according to the Chachamim, even if the people in the inner courtyard can't carry, they still don't affect the people in the outer courtyard. So according to Rabbi Yanai, there's a new view here that we haven't discussed yet, which is that just like Rabbi Akiva doesn't distinguish between whether the people in the inner courtyard made their own eruv or not, he says until the entire place is merged, it's no good. Even if the people in the inner courtyard can carry within their own courtyard, they're still going to ruin it for the outer courtyard. The Chachamim say the opposite. Even if the inner courtyard didn't do anything, and therefore they are no good, they can't carry in their own domain, they don't affect the outer courtyard. In other words, it doesn't matter either way. Whether they did or didn't, they don't affect the outer courtyard. So Tanan, we learned in the Mishnah, it says in the Mishnah that if the outer courtyard made an eruv but not the inner courtyard, that both courtyards are prohibited. Now according to you, whose opinion is this following? Because if it's Rabbi Akiva's opinion, because if it's Rabbi Akiva's, you're telling me this Mishnah follows Rabbi Akiva. But the first case in the Mishnah, it doesn't make any sense for Rabbi Akiva. Why? Because it's saying that if the inner courtyard didn't make an eruv, that ruins it for the outer courtyard. But according to Rabbi Akiva, even if they did make an eruv, it still ruins it for the outer courtyard. The inner courtyard always will ruin the outer courtyard unless the two merge together. And if you're going to tell me Elel Rabbanan, you're going to tell me it's really the rabbis, Elelav Rabbanan, right? So you're going to tell me it's the rabbi's opinion. But you just told me that the rabbis say that even when there's no eruv in the inner courtyard, it doesn't affect the outer. In other words, the two positions are extreme, right? According to the rabbis, the inner never affects the outer. According to Rabbi Akiva, it always ruins the outer, right? So you can't have distinctions here about whether the inner one made an eruv or not. Le'olam Rabbi Akiva. You know what? We'll settle that it's really Rabbi Akiva. The only thing is, then it's telling you not only this, but also this. That's a style of the Mishnah. Sometimes the Mishnah will start with a case that is the case that you might take for granted, and then go even further and say even not only this, but even this. So it'll start with a case that maybe is not the most extreme case. For Rabbi Akiva, the most extreme case is that even when the inner courtyard makes an eruv, they still ruin it for the outer courtyard. But he says, lo zo avzo katani, meaning not only this, but even this. The Mishnah starts with a case that is, we can see why the inner courtyard would ruin the outer courtyard's situation if they didn't make an eruv. But not only that, says Rabbi Akiva, even When they did make an Eruv, they still ruin it. So true, it's not the biggest novelty from Rabbi Akiva's perspective, the case where the inner courtyard didn't make an Eruv. But still, he mentions it, and this Mishnah really follows Rabbi Akiva. But now the Gemara says, but wait, it's not Erva Zol Atzma V'Zol Atzma Muteret B'fnei Atzma V'Zol Muteret B'fnei Atzma. So it said that if each one of the Chatzirot made its own independent Eruv, right? So then each one is okay in its own place. But as Ta'amad de Ereva, the implication is that the only reason why each one is permitted in its own place is because each one made its own Eruv. But halo Ereva Shitein Asurot. But if the inner courtyard didn't make an Eruv, that would ruin it for the outer courtyard. But veha haytana de amar regel muteret ina oseret regel asura oseret. So the implication is then that although when they make an Eruv in the inner courtyard, it doesn't affect the outer courtyard anymore, when they don't make an Eruv in the inner courtyard, it would ruin it for the outer. So Mani, who is the author of this? Maniha, who is the opinion here? So Ilema Rabbi Akiva hi afilu regela muteret nami lav rabanani. So the problem is that has to be the rabbis. It can't be Rabbi Akiva, because Rabbi Akiva is going to say even in the case where they both made an Eruv, the outer courtyard is no good, because they have to merge together. So, and saying that the outer courtyard status is dependent on the inner courtyard is going like the rabbis. And yet it's saying that they must have made an Eruv. So, ve'od, and furthermore, mitzsefa Rabbi Akiva, Reish Lav Rabbi Akiva. And remember, at the end of the Mishnah, it says, Rabbi Akiva says such and such, implying that the rest of the Mishnah was not Rabbi Akiva. Okay? So this can't be Rabbi Akiva. So rather, Kula Rabbi Akiva. You know what? We're going to amend the Mishnah a little bit, and we're going to say that it really follows Rabbi Akiva. V'chasrei mechasra. It's missing a part, and this is what it should say. Erva zo la'atzma v'zo la'atzma. Zo muter b'fnei atzma v'zo muter b'fnei atzma. That if each one made its own Eruv, the inner courtyard made its own Eruv, and the outer courtyard made its own Eruv, then we're good. B'amed dvarim amurim. When is that stated? Sha'asita daka. If they made a small partition, a daka is a very makeshift partition out of small pieces of wood going across the dividing line between the two courtyards. Okay, they made a little dividing line. Aval lo asita daka. If they didn't do that, chitzona asura, then the outer one will be prohibited. Divrei Rabbi Akiva. She Rabbi Akiva oseret achitzona, mipnei shedrisat regel oseret. That Rabbi Akiva says, because Rabbi Akiva prohibits the outer courtyard because of the walking of the inner courtyard. Okay, since they're looked at as contiguous. But when you put a little something on the ground to divide them, then even Rabbi Akiva will say that they have separate status.
Is the requirement for that something that a person can't pass it? Can't walk?
It wouldn't, no, it would be passable, but it would just be an obstruction to show, I guess, the difference between the two.
It's symbolic.
It's more symbolic, yeah. Okay. So Rashi says, Shasta daka means pnimit asda delet ktana, a small door in front of its opening. V'silika drisat ragla mechitzona. That it means that so apparently according to Rashi, that means that they have to say that they're not going to use the outer courtyard. In other words, they put up a little partition. They don't have to make a full wall, but they have to say, we're not using it for Shabbat. We're not going to pass through. Okay? So by removing themselves from the outer courtyard for the Shabbat, they're saying we're independent. We're putting up this little partition to show that we're independent, and we're independent. Okay? So that's the idea. So that, because Rabbi Akiva says that as long as the inner courtyard is going to be using the outer courtyard, they're going to be, they're going to be ruining it for them. Even if the inner courtyard makes an Eruv and the outer courtyard makes an Eruv, it doesn't matter. And the Chachamim are not concerned with that. So that's how Rabbi Yanai interprets the Mishnah. That this Mishnah is following, that there are two extreme opinions, basically. One opinion is Rabbi Akiva, that as long as these two Chatzirot are connected, even if the inner one makes an Eruv, it's still going to ruin the outer one unless they completely remove themselves from using the outer courtyard for that Shabbat, right? And they make a little doorway or a little partition.
And that amendment of the Mishnah is not really an amendment.
It's not really an amendment. They're saying that it's implied.
It's just to understand and interpret.
It's an interpretation there.
Okay.
So usually, I haven't checked. I didn't have time to check, but usually when they amend it like this, that means that in the Tosefta there's a version like that, and they're saying that the Tosefta's content is implied in the Mishnah. So it probably has a precedent. They usually don't just pull these out of a hat. It's usually in the Tosefta. So anyway, so therefore they have two extreme opinions. And then you have the Chachamim who say no matter what the inner courtyard does, the outer courtyard is shielded. It doesn't affect it at all. Okay, so you have these two views now. Mativ Rav Bevai Bar Abaye, Rav Bevai Bar Abaye raised an objection. Ve'im hayu shel yachidim en tzrechin arev. It says that if the inner courtyard was occupied by a yachid, by an individual, they don't need an eruv, right? If the inner and outer courtyard were occupied by individuals, they don't need an eruv at all. So hashel rabim tzrechin arev, implying that if there are multiple individuals involved, they do need an eruv. So alma. What does that imply? The implication is, by saying that if the inner courtyard had more than one person in it, they're going to need to make an eruv, the implication is that would affect everybody. That would affect the outer courtyard as well. And furthermore, Mativ Ravina raised an objection. How could it be, if the Chachamim really say that it doesn't matter whether somebody makes an eruv, whether the inner courtyard makes an eruv or not, then how come it says that if the outer courtyard forgets to make its eruv, or they fail to make it, somebody is left out, and the inner courtyard makes an eruv, that the inner courtyard is okay, but the outer courtyard is not okay? But if the inner courtyard forgets, then even if the outer courtyard does it, they're ruined. So according to you, it doesn't make a difference whether the inner courtyard makes an eruv or not, because according to the Chachamim, it's always not going to affect the outer courtyard, and according to Rabbi Akiva, it's always going to ruin it. So why does it make a distinction between whether the inner courtyard made an eruv or not? Answer: Ta'amad shachach, halo shachach shten mutarot. In other words, what he says is that the implication is that the outer courtyard status is in fact dependent on the inner courtyard, right? Alma regela muteret ina oseret regela oseret, and that therefore it's not like Rabbi Akiva that it's all or nothing. That according to Rabbi Akiva, the inner courtyard is the fact that there's even another courtyard ruins it for everybody. And according to the Chachamim, the fact that there's an inner courtyard doesn't affect the outer courtyard at all. That's what you're trying to tell me. But it's not true. The inner courtyard status does affect the outer courtyard status. You see it from here, because if the outer courtyard doesn't make an eruv, the inner courtyard is fine. But if the inner courtyard doesn't make an eruv, then it ruins the outer courtyard. So its status is significant. So Ela ki ata Ravin am Rabbi Yanai. Rather, when Ravin came, he said in the name of Rabbi Yanai that we had it all wrong. It's not just two opinions that go mina katzeh la katzeh, that go from one extreme to another. But rather, it's gimel machlokot badavar. There are three positions here. Tanaka masavar regela muteret ena useret regela asura useret. The first Tana in our Mishnah, who's represented in our Mishnah, says that if the inner courtyard fixes itself, then it saves then it won't prohibit the outer courtyard. But if it fails to fix itself, then it prohibits. That's regel ha'oseret. Regel ha'asura oseret. That if the inner courtyard cannot carry in its own place, then it also ruins the outer courtyard. If the inner courtyard can carry in its own place because they made an eruv chatzerot, then they don't affect the outer courtyard. That is the rule of the Tanakama. Rabbi Akiva says regel muteret oseret, and Rabbi Akiva says it doesn't matter whether even if they made an eruv in the inner courtyard, the fact that they're passing through the outer courtyard means that they are messing it up for the outer courtyard, and they must merge together in order to permit. And for Rabbanan Batrae, the second rabbis, in other words, the later rabbi said, that the later rabbis, the later Chachamim, who are mentioned later in the Mishnah, right after Rabbi Akiva says, "V'chachamim omrim," the rabbis say that it's not going to, that ein drisat regel osarta, that walking through doesn't ruin it. That's a third opinion. There's the Tanakama and there's the Chachamim. So there really are three. What Rabbi Yanai was showing, he wasn't saying that there are only two opinions. That was we had a misunderstanding of Rabbi Yanai. Rabbi Yanai was saying there are two opinions. There's a hidden opinion that's not explicit that you have to infer from the Mishnah. That there are really three positions. There's the position that says the inner courtyard always ruins the outer. There's a position that says the inner courtyard never affects the outer. And there's a third position, which is the position of the Tanakama, that it depends. If the status of the inner courtyard is a green light that they can carry because they did an eruvei chatzerot, then it will be good. for the outer courtyard. And if the status of the inner courtyard is bad, it's red, status code red, they can't carry, then it will ruin the outer courtyard as well. So now we move forward. So it said, so it made a distinction. It said if they take the eruv, now the eruv is actually physical, it's bread that's placed in one of the houses in one of the courtyards. So if you have these two courtyards, and what they did was they merged in this case. Okay? So they took the eruv and they put the eruv into one of the houses in one of the courtyards. Now it says if they put it b'makom echad. And first it says if somebody forgot to participate in the eruv, whether they're from the inside or from the outside, okay, then both courtyards will be ruined. Right? That's what it said before. So now, then it gives a siman. Chitzona atzma bebeit yachida'a ravina delam mishakach bifnim. So these are mnemonics to remember the next sugya. Amar Rav Yehuda Amar Rav. What's the first thing? Chitzona. The first siman was chitzona, the external one. In other words, when in our Mishnah, when it says if they put the bread in one of the courtyards and anybody in the entire two courtyards forgot to participate, it will be ruined for everybody. So that was, and remember, each courtyard is making its own eruv, and then they're combining. Okay, so they each make their own eruv, and then they combine.
And this is the combined one.
And the combined one was put in the outside, right? So this is talking about when the combined was put on the outside. Umay karula makom echad. Why is it called makom echad? Yeah. No, I think that's the other next case. So my makom echad. Why umay karula makom echad? Why is it called makom echad? One place. Makom miyuchad l'shtehen, because the outer courtyard is the one that both people use. Both groups use. So it's called miyuchad. It's the one that's set aside for everybody. Because it's the place that they all use, because the inner courtyard exits through the outer courtyard. We actually learned this before. We learned this a few dapim ago, this exact point. Okay? Now we turn to Amud Bet. Tanya Nam Yachi, we similarly learned. Natnu eruvan b'chitzona v'shachach echad ben min hachitzona ben min penimit v'lo erev shetehen asurot. If they put their eruv in the outer courtyard and one of them forgot, it doesn't matter who it was. Somebody from the inner courtyard or someone from the outer courtyard, they're both prohibited. But natnu eruvan b'penimit. If the eruv was placed in the inner courtyard, v'shachach echad min penimit v'lo erev shetehen asurot. If somebody from the inner courtyard messed up, then it ruins it for everybody. But if somebody from the, and if somebody from the outer courtyard messed up, they're also both prohibited. Divrei Rabbi Akiva. So here we have the machloket between Rabbi Akiva and Chachamim again. In other words, according to Rabbi Akiva, the only time anybody in this whole system of the two chatzerot is going to be able to carry is if everybody's together. So if anyone's, it doesn't matter where the eruv is. If it's in the outside, it's in the inside, it's up, it's down, it's all around, it doesn't matter. If anybody is out, the entire thing is ruined, because since the inner courtyard has drisat regel, that it walks out of the outer courtyard, they're all considered one, and they all have to be together and merge together. Now, but according to the Chachamim, the inner courtyard always has the upper hand. The inner courtyard has the upper hand. So therefore, if the eruv was placed in the outer courtyard and anybody forgot, then everyone loses. But if it's in the inner courtyard and everybody in the inner courtyard did what they were supposed to do, but somebody in the outer courtyard messed up, so we learned a few dapim ago, maybe it was last week, what the inner courtyard can close the door and say, thank you very much, we don't want you. We didn't invite you to ruin our eruv, thank you, stay out. Since you guys messed up, it's your problem. And that way they can seal themselves off, and they can say, we're independent. We're just not gonna. We're not gonna carry out of our chatzer. We're gonna close off, and we're gonna be our own people. Okay, so that's the solution according to the Chachamim. According to Rabbi Akiva, that won't work. It won't work according to Rabbi Akiva unless they actually put a partition and they actually say, we're withdrawing from you, and they don't go out. But according to the Chachamim, the reality is that the inner courtyard could have made their own Eruvei Chatzerot anyway. Right? They could have made their own anyway. So they can just say, we have the eruv here. This is our eruv. You guys didn't make a good eruv. Fine, that's your problem. It's not our problem. We can make our own eruv anyway, and we're still allowed to walk out of the outer chatzer. It's just, they lose. So that's what the Chachamim say. Now, the Gemara says, Amar le Rabba Bar Hanan Abaye. Rabba Bar Hanan said to Abaye, Ma yishena le Rabbanan da'amrei penimit muteret mishum da'ahadadasha o mishtamsha. What's the reason why the inner courtyard is permitted in this case? It's because the inner courtyard can close the door and say, we don't want anything to do with you. Now that's metaphoric. It doesn't mean they actually have to have a door that they close. What it means to say is that they say, we're withdrawing. We don't want to be in an eruv with you. We didn't invite you to ruin our eruv. We were fine without you. Okay, you made things worse for us. So the Rabbi Akiva Nami. So what about according to Rabbi Akiva? Tihaddasha u'tshamesh. Why can't they do the same thing? Why can't the inner courtyard seal itself off? So Amar Lei. Okay, so he said back to him. This is Abaye is responding to Rabbi Bar Chanan. Eruv Margila. The fact is that the eruv is in the inner courtyard, right? And since the eruv is in the inner courtyard, that means that the people in the outer courtyard are connected. In other words, they're coming in. They came in to bring the eruv there. They have a connection with the inner courtyard. So it's not so simple that they can just close the door in the inner courtyard and push them out. L'Rabbanan nami eruv margila. But what about for the rabbis? Don't the rabbis also say, from the fact that they're placing the eruv in the inner courtyard, that means that people from the outer courtyard are bringing it in. So they have it. They're coming into the inner courtyard. They're sharing the space. They're part of the same community. So the Gemara answers the Amra, because the inner courtyard will say letakune shitaftich v'lo la'avuteh. They will say, we invited you to help us, not to hurt us. Right? We don't want your partnership if it's going to ruin us. So from the beginning, we only undertook this nice partnership for the benefit of everyone. But if we thought now not only will we be able to carry in our own chatzer, but we'll even be able to carry in your chatzer. But now that you messed us up, why should we even be prohibited in our own chatzer? We didn't need you to carry in our own chatzer. You're out now. We don't want the partnership. So because they can say that's why they're able to be independent. But the Rabbi Akiva nami tema letakunes shitaftich lo la'avuteh. So why, according to Rabbi Akiva, can't they say that? Why can't they say the same? They'll say the same thing, that we only wanted to partner with you, and now we're sealing off. Now, according to Rabbi Akiva, the outer courtyard is going to be ruined anyway, right? In all cases, anyway. So, but why would it ruin the inner courtyard? Why can't the inner courtyard just say, we don't want anything to do with you? Why wouldn't that work? So the Amrala, because what the outer courtyard will say is mivatlinan lach rishuti, that we're going to do bitul reshut. Remember, the other way that they can accomplish eruv is if somebody relinquishes their rights. So the outer courtyard can say, we're relinquishing our rights to the inner courtyard. We're going to relinquish our rights, and therefore the entire thing is yours. Nobody in the outer courtyard is going to carry out this Shabbat. We're relinquishing our rights to the inner courtyard, and therefore the entire thing is yours. But actually, that's a problem. Why? Because they're saying, we're not ruining anything for you.
But they were waiting for this.
But wait. So listen, it's like you have to follow the path of the reasoning, because yes, they can do that. The people in the outer courtyard can do that. In other words, they can fix it. They can fix it because they're stuck anyway. For sure, the outer courtyard is not going to be able to carry because they didn't do a complete eruv anyway. But they're impinging on the inner courtyard. But what can they say? So the Chachamim say that the inner courtyard will say, well, we didn't want you because we don't want someone to ruin our eruv. Rabbi Akiva comes back and says, no, that's not true. Because the outer courtyard will say, we're not ruining anything because we can always relinquish our rights to the inner courtyard. And since we can always relinquish our rights to the inner courtyard, that means we're not really ruining anything. Because if we relinquish if the outer courtyard subordinates itself, so to speak, relinquishes its rights to the inner courtyard, then that fixes everything for the inner courtyard. Not only will they be able to carry in their own courtyard, they can carry even in the outer courtyard now, because the outer courtyard gave up. They surrendered to the inner courtyard. But the very fact that they're able to do that means that they're not a pure liability. They're not a pure liability. And the whole logic that the rabbis are using is that they're saying you're a pure liability because all you're doing is ruining. But the outer courtyard will say, no, we're not ruining because we'll just relinquish our rights to the outer courtyard. We're helping. So we still want to keep the partnership. The only thing is that if they keep the partnership, until they actually relinquish their rights, they're ruining it. Okay, so let's say, for example, you come Friday night, and we realize that Joe Schmo lives in the outer courtyard. He forgot to make the eruv. So at that moment, what's the status of the inner courtyard now? So the people in the inner courtyard will say, well, our whole partnership with you is predicated on that you're going to help us. Instead, you're ruining. So since you're ruining, we don't want anything to do with you. It's as if we never had the partnership, and you don't affect us at all. The outer courtyard will say, according to Rabbi Akiva, will say back, what do you mean we're ruining? We can all just be mivatel reshut. We can give up our right to the courtyard, to the outer courtyard right now. They can do that on Shabbat.
Right.
We'll do it right now, and therefore we're not a liability. We're still friends. We're still partners. So, but we haven't done it yet. We haven't relinquished yet. So at that moment, when they realize that they can relinquish, but they haven't relinquished, are they a total liability? Not necessarily, because they can relinquish. But right now, they're still holding them back from being able to carry because they haven't yet relinquished. In other words, they have the capacity to relinquish, but they haven't done it yet. So, and that's the whole issue here. So, v'Rabbanan ein bitul reshut nechatzer lachatzer. The rabbis hold that you can't do bitul reshut from one chatzer to another. We learned earlier in the Masekhet about this issue. So therefore, once it turns out that the outer courtyard has failed to make an eruv, they are a pure liability. They're a pure liability. Okay? There's nothing they can do because they can't give up their rights of their courtyard to the other courtyard. So it's 100% liability. So therefore we say we never made a partnership with you. It's a liability for us. We don't want it. According to Rabbi Akiva, the outer courtyard can give up its rights to the inner courtyard. And therefore, since they can, they're not a pure liability. And since they're not a pure liability, that means there's still a partnership. Until, and that partnership is going to be in effect, and therefore a problem for the inner courtyard, until the outer courtyard actually goes ahead and gives up their rights. Okay, so it's somewhat counterintuitive because the benefit that the outer courtyard can give up its rights ends up being a temporary liability because it means that the partnership is still intact. Because they have a basis for the partnership. Now, Lema Shmuel v'Rabbi Yochanan beplugta d'Rabbanan v'Rabbi Akiva kamipalgei. Now, if we turn the clock back a little bit, we will remember that there was a big machloket about whether you can be mevatel reshut meichatzer lachatzer, whether one courtyard can give up its rights to another courtyard. That was already a machloket between Shmuel and Rabbi Yochanan. Rabbi Yochanan says you can, Shmuel says you can't. Now, according to this lining up of the machloket here, Shmuel is following the Rabbanan. Right? And Rabbi Yochanan is following Rabbi Akiva. So is that true? That they were actually taking sides in a dispute between Tanaim? That's not normally the case. Normally the Amoraim will go with the consensus of Tanaim. They're not going to take one side over the other. So how could it be? So the answer is that Amar lach Shmuel will answer for you. Anad Amre afilu l'Rabbi Akiva. I can square my position. I hold that you cannot give up rights from one courtyard to another. But I can reconcile my view even with Rabbi Akiva. Why? Because ad kan lo kama Rabbi Akiva acha ele b'shtei chatzerot lefnim mizod asrana hadadeh. Avalatam mika asrana hadadeh. Because I'll say to you that what's the typical case of bitul reshut from one chatzer to another? It's where you have adjoining chatzerot. They don't interfere with one another. They're just next door neighbors. So they want to be able to carry from one to the other. And let's say they didn't make an eruv. So one says, you know what, we'll give up our rights so you can carry in our chatzer too. Okay? But there's no problem. There's just a benefit. In other words, there was no problem originally because the people in Chatzer number 1 made their own eruv. People in Chatzer number 2 made their own eruv. They just didn't make one together. But now let's say the people in Chatzer number 2, we're going to do a picnic for the people in Chatzer number 1. They want to bring over the picnic, but they can't bring it because they don't have an eruv with each other. Okay? So they can say, okay, we're mevatel our reshut to you. So that's where Shmuel says, that's just getting something. You're not solving a problem. You're just gaining a benefit. That's where I don't allow it. But here, Rabbi Akiva's case is where the outer courtyard is ruining it for the inner courtyard. And since they're going to ruin it for the inner courtyard, even I will allow bitul reshut from one chatzer to the other. Now it happens to be that in this case, the bitul reshut from one chatzer to the other is a problem. Because as long as they haven't actually relinquished their rights, that the power that they have to give up their rights actually makes the partnership worthwhile to the inner chatzer. Because if they were to give up their rights, now the inner chatzer can carry even into the outer chatzer. Right? So since it's still worthwhile, that means they're still holding back the inner chatzer because they're keeping the partnership intact. But ultimately it's a benefit. Because if they do it, it will allow the inner chatzer to carry even into the outer chatzer. That's what Shmuel says. Now, And Rabbi Yochanan, who normally says you can give up your rights from one chatzer to another. So why here? How's he going to deal with the rabbis who here say apparently that you can't? So he says, I'm going to say ana da'amre afilu l'Rabbanan ad kan lo kamre Rabbanan hacha ela da'amra la ad mivaltaltli ka'asrat ilai. Aval hatam mika asrat Allah. So what he says is that in our case here, what do the rabbis say? The rabbis say that the reason why there's no bitul reshut is because at the moment, right now, when the outer courtyard has not yet given up its rights, the inner courtyard immediately cancels the partnership. The fact that the outer courtyard has the potential to give up its rights to the inner courtyard doesn't mean anything to the people in the inner courtyard.
So could they be talking about someone who is, messing it up for the other one, or
It could be on purpose. It doesn't matter. It's just
no, but that would make a difference because one.
Well, if they did it on purpose,
the other one,
it says shachach. It says shachach. Right. I mean, if the person in the outer courtyard that refused to participate, right. So then he's also going to refuse probably to do bitul reshut. He's not a nice guy. Whatever. He's not a nice guy. So that's right. That's true. That's true. So that's what we're talking with the case of shachach. The case of shachach.
So we're not talking.
Right. So we're not talking about that. Right. But the point is that according to this view, so Rabbi Yochanan say, yeah, true. I believe that one can be mivatel reshut from one to the other. The only thing is that the outer chatzer has not done that as of the moment right now, and so therefore the inner chatzer cancels the partnership immediately because right now we don't care about the potential. Right now I can't carry out of my house because the outer courtyard is holding me back. True, they can give up their rights to their chatzer, therefore allowing me not only to carry in my own but also to carry in theirs, but they haven't done that yet, so what do I care what they could do later? Right, whereas Rabbi Yochanan says, so there the rabbis don't care about bitul reshut. He says, but Rabbi Yochanan saying, according to me, even the rabbis hold of the idea, in theory, that one chatzer could give up its rights to another chatzer. It's just that in this case it's not relevant, because right now they haven't done it yet. Right. Okay, whereas in the typical case of bitul reshut from one chatzer to another, there's no issue of prohibitions or anything like that. It's merely an issue of joining and partnership across chatzerot, and there, according to Rabbi Yochanan, it's no problem at all. Here, the issue is something else, not whether they can give up their rights from one chatzer to another, but whether that's going to keep the partnership intact. And according to the rabbis, it doesn't keep the partnership intact because lema'aseh, right away, they can't carry out of their house. Okay, so now we move to the next piece. So we said if there are individuals involved, and now we're going to get to the case that Yaakov mentioned before, that he asked about before. Amar Rav Yosef says, Tane Rabbi taught, Hayu Gimel Asurin. If there are 3 people, it's prohibited. So what does this mean? If there were 3 people, it's prohibited. What this means is that if the person on the inside, in other words, if there are 2 chatzerot and there are 3 people between the 2 of them, okay, implying whether there are 2 on the inside and only 1 on the outside, or the 2 are on the outside and 1 is on the inside, the problem is going to exist no matter what. Okay? In other words, even though normally the one guy on the inside really shouldn't affect the people on the outside, because the guy on the inside doesn't have a requirement to make an Eruv Chatzerot because he doesn't have an Eruv, it's just one person. But since you have 2 people in the outer courtyard, they should all make an Eruv together. We're going to see why this is. But the point is right now, he says, Tanei Rabbi Yehuda Nasi said this. So Amar Lahu Rav Bevai. Now who's Rav Bevai? Probably the son. Rav Bevai is usually the son of Abaye. Abaye was the student of Rav Yosef. So it could be that it's the son of Abaye, although it doesn't call him here Rav Bevai bar Abaye, but it could be. Lo tatzitule. Don't listen to him. Okay? Now, Ana Amrita Nihala, Umishmed Ravadabarava Amrita Nihala. I told him that halacha, that if there are 3 people involved, it's prohibited. And I told him it in the name of Rav Adabar Ava. Okay? Ho'il v'ani kore behen rabim b'chitzona. That since there are multiple people in the outer courtyard, and people will see that there are multiple people in the outer courtyard, and they're going to not know that there's only one person living in the inner courtyard. So they're not going to understand why, without an eruvei chatzerot, with the person on the inside, they're able to carry back and forth between the chatzerot. So now, halachically, really they should be, because the inner courtyard is like paraf. The outer courtyard has an eruv. So there's no problem. The inner courtyard guy should be able to carry, and the outer court, in his own courtyard, and the outer courtyard people have their own eruv, so it shouldn't be a problem. But the inner courtyard guy has no obligation of any eruv because he's on his own. So now he's not even considered a chatzer really. He's not really considered to have a chatzer because it's just considered from going from one person to one person, like from one private house to another private house. So because the eruv of the outer courtyard unites them. But the point is that since people see on the outside that there's two people, they don't know how many people live in the inner courtyard. They're going to say, well, how come they don't have an eruv too? And how come they don't have an eruv with you? And yet, they're not going to know who's from what chatzer. Now, but the point is that Rabbi never said that. Now, why is that significant? Because Rav Yosef, we know, had Alzheimer's, or he had some kind of Alzheimer's or dementia. He forgot a lot of his learning, and so at the end of his life, a lot of times he would mix things up, or he would forget things. Amar Rav Yosef said, Mared Avraham, master of Avraham, meaning by Hashem. It's sort of like a way of swearing, like, oh my God. That's how we would say it today. So he said, Rabim b'Rabbi ichalafli. I mixed up the word Rabim with the word Rabbi. I said it as Rabbi says such and such. Tani Rabbi, that Rabbi said it, and really it was supposed to be Rabim. If there are three people, Rabim means three people, right? Rabim ayu gimel. Rabim means three. He mixed up his text. Shmuel Amar, but Shmuel, and this is what the halacha follows, le'olam mutarot at shiyu shinayim b'pnimit ve'achad b'chitzona. That in the only case where you need an eruv, where this becomes a problem, is if the inner courtyard has two people and the outer one has one person, like you said before. Okay? Why? Because if the inner courtyard only has one, it's not going to create any prohibitions on the outer courtyard. The outer courtyard can make its own eruv, and you just have two singular entities. No problem. But if the inner courtyard has two and the outer courtyard has one, now you're going to have more of a problem. So, and he says that Rashi explains on the side here that he says that wait, was there a? Oh no, he doesn't explain that. He explains the next part. Okay, so. Right, and really everybody agrees that the primary case is where the inner courtyard has two people, because the inner courtyard having two people affects everybody, because if the inner courtyard doesn't have an eruv, it ruins it for everybody, and if they do have one, it helps everybody. Okay? But if there's one person in the inside, he won't affect anything. Only the outer courtyard needs an eruv. So but Rav Yosef is saying that there's a gezerah that still they have to make an eruv with the inner guy, because of appearances, because of confusion, basically. People will be confused. Now, Amar Rabbi Elazar said, V'nochri harehu karabim. If a non-Jew lives in the inner courtyard, it's like having two people live there. So now the question is, Ma'ishena Yisrael de la Sar de man yada yada uman lo yada savar eruvi erev. So what's the reason why if only one Jew lives inside the inner courtyard, we don't consider it a problem? Because anybody who knows the situation will know the situation, and anybody who doesn't know the situation will assume that they made an eruv. He's not going to know it. If you know, you know, and if you don't know, you don't know. Okay? However, similarly, if you have a non-Jew living in the inner courtyard, then either a person will know the status of what's going on, or if they don't know the status, they'll assume that they rented the space from the inner courtyard. They rented the space from the person inside. Because remember that if you have a non-Jew sharing a courtyard with Jews, that they have to rent his rights to the chatzer in order to factor him out so they can make an eruv, basically. So in this case, the inner courtyard, just having the non-Jew in there, is not going to affect the outer courtyard, because no Jew actually lives in the same courtyard as the non-Jew.
So this is,
okay?
as long as only one, it's okay to assume?
They're saying that it doesn't make any sense, because if a person knows the whole situation, they'll know that only one non-Jew lives alone in the inner courtyard, and that's why they didn't have to rent from him. And if they don't know the story, they'll probably just assume they rented from him, because they don't know the story.
But the story, is it only on the doubt of one, or is that because
the person just doesn't know what the situation is in this chatzer? He just doesn't know. But the question is, if you don't know, then why would you make assumptions? And if you do know, you'll know, right? So the answer is tam nochri ita ogar mif'apa'e. That usually the non-Jew, if he rented out his rights to the chatzer, it would be known. He would talk about it. He would mention it. People would hear about it. So the concern is that people will assume that it wasn't done if they don't hear about it. Okay? And therefore a person will know that a non-Jew lives in there. They don't know what the actual setup is, but they do know that he didn't rent it. That he wasn't rented from. His rights to the Chatzer weren't rented from. But they don't know that it's a special case where the non-Jew is alone in the inner Chatzer. They don't know the exact details. They just know that there's a non-Jew in the picture, and that they assume that they didn't rent from him because they didn't hear anything about any rental going on. So therefore, we have to go out of our way to treat it as if the non-Jew lives in the Chatzer with the outer people. To clarify that, so if a Jew lives in the inner courtyard, it's just one Jew. So then he doesn't prohibit the rest of the system. It's no problem. If two Jews live on the inside and one lives on the outside, then they all have to make an Eruv Chatzerot together for sure, because the inner Chatzer is going to affect the outer one. If they make an Eruv, even though there's only one person on the outside, so still they make an Eruv together. And in a case where the non-Jew lives in the inner Chatzer, there, since generally people will assume that nothing was done unless they know that it was done, therefore we have to rent from the non-Jew, even though normally he wouldn't affect us because it's just one non-Jew living in the Chatzer alone. Now, Amar Rav Yehuda, Amar Shmuel, Rav Yehuda said, the Shmuel said, Yud batim ze lifnei mizeh, penimin notenet eruvo v'dayo. So this is an interesting case, and this is the case that we saw in that illustration there. So what you have here is a case of 10 houses, and only the last house, this is illustration number 243, only the last house opens to the Chatzer. So they all open one to the other. This one opens to this one, to this one, to this one. You have to pass through all these houses to come out into the courtyard. So how many actually open to the courtyard? Right? How many open to the courtyard? Only one, and then there are two other houses opening to the courtyard directly. So they're making an Eruv Chatzerot. Only this house needs to join. Because only this house actually exits into the courtyard. You see that? Even though all of these guys are going to come to the courtyard, but really only this house opens to it.
Because those aren't
They're not courtyard houses. Right.
They're tall houses.
Yeah.
Right. So they're like townhouses. They're like townhouses. Now, so what happens? Amar Rabbi Yochanan, Amar afilu chitzon. Even the outer one has to has to join in the Eruv. So the Gemara asks, Chitzon beit sha'aru. But the Chitzon, the outer one, is just a gatehouse, meaning it's the house that people pass through to get to the courtyard. In other words, that's the issue. All of these are just passageways to get to the final house to get out. They're not in and of themselves a house that's on the courtyard, but they're functioning as passageways. If that's the case, so what he meant was chitzon shel penimi. The chitzon shel penimi. So what he meant was, this is the chitzon shel penimi, this one here. Okay? So according to Rabbi Yochanan, this one requires joining in the Eruv also. The second one.
The one before the last one.
The second to last. Okay?
Why?
Second to last. So we're going to see why.
Oh, okay.
We're going to see why. Now, what's the reason? So the Gemara says, and that's a machloket with Shmuel. So what's the machloket? The machloket is b'maika mipalgei. Mar savar bet sha'ar diyachid shemei bet sha'ar, or mar savar lo shemei bet sha'ar. That the question is, everyone agrees that what's called a gatehouse, in other words, a house that's a passageway to another house. Okay, everyone agrees that doesn't have a status of a house with regard to the courtyard. But the problem is that here, that house, that second to last house, is only a gatehouse for the first house. In other words, since it's the second house in the row, only people from the first house have to use it.
Which one's the first house? First house
second.
is this one.
Yeah.
You call it this the first house?
That's the first house.
This is the first house. Okay.
They're calling it the outer one, right? Right. So this one has to pass through this to get here,
right?
And then here. So this house, for example, is a passageway for both of these houses. This one is a passageway for all three of these houses. This one is for all four,
okay.
Right? So the second one, only the first house passes through it.
And they never use those courtyards.
They're never used as courtyards. I guess they enter their house from the side.
And nobody wants to do anything in the courtyard because there's only one house in the courtyard.
Right, there's only one house that faces the courtyard directly. So
is the inference
but that implies that it changes the status of that house
from a house to a
Beit Sha'ar, right, to a passageway, right. From the perspective of the courtyard, that's going to be true.
Is the inference here that there's a hallway running down the length of these houses?
There must be some kind of a hallway going down the length of it, I guess. Otherwise, it would be a really crazy situation, right?
Like go on through your bedroom or your kitchen or something?
Right, exactly.
So if that's the case, then the owners of that house would have to relinquish their rights.
Right, so everybody, so only that inner courtyard is going to be significant, right? Now, okay, so the inner one that opens to the courtyard, and according to Rabbi Yochanan, the second to last one will also be. Why? Because since it only functions for one other house as a passageway, it only functions as for one other house, so therefore it's not really fully fledged as a passageway, because it's only a passageway for one other house. It's not a passageway for more than one. And so Rabbi Yochanan says, since it's not a passageway for more than one, it's not considered a passageway, it's not considered a Beit Sha'ar, it's considered a house still. According to Shmuel, the fact that it functions even for one is enough to say that it is a...
Why would it need more than one to not be considered a passageway?
I don't know exactly why, but I guess, it's a good question.
Passageway to get to the last house.
I don't know why that's his measurement for what's considered a passageway. Now, and of course the outer house exits to the open field, exits to the Reshut HaRabim. So that's why it doesn't need to participate in the Eruv at all. Yeah. But the rest of them, they all exit through the courtyard. It's just that they exit by going through everyone else's house first. Yeah, I assume there was some kind of a secret passageway that they went through. They didn't walk into people's dining room and say, "Hey, sorry, excuse me." That would be crazy. Now, Amar Rav Nachman said, Amar Rabba Baravwa, in the name of Rabba Baravwa, Amar Rav, in the name of Rav. Shte chatzerot v'gimel batim benehen. This is a very interesting setup. You have two chatzerot. In between them are three houses. How does it work? House A adjoins courtyard number 1. Okay, and spills into it. They have a picture? Yeah, there you go. Yeah. What number is that?
This is the very next one, 244.
244. So you have three houses. Okay. This house over here opens to this courtyard. This house over here opens to this courtyard, and then there's a house in between them. They're like townhomes. They're linked. Okay. And so the middle house doesn't open directly to any one of them. Okay, so what's going to happen is like this. That the case is that ze ba derech ze v'noten eruvo bazeh. V'ze ba derech ze v'noten eruvo bazeh. As we turn to Ayin Vav Amud Aleph, ze nasa bet shar lezeh, v'ze nasa bet shar lezeh. Emtza'i havale bayit shemenichin bo eruv ve'en derech liten et hapat. So what ends up happening is that you have an unusual situation because the people in this courtyard put their eruv in here. Okay, remember there's another house opening to here. That's why they have an eruv chatzerot. So between the two, so the guy who lives here, okay, he goes and he puts, or let's say this guy even. So he goes and he puts the eruv in here. The guy here puts the eruv. You could look at. Oh, you don't have it. This guy over here. Let's call it Chatzer number 1. Okay, the person Chatzer number 1 goes and walks through this house and puts it in the middle house. The person Chatzer number 2 walks through the house that's adjoining Chatzer number 2 and puts it in the middle house as well. So what ends up happening is both of the Eruvin are in the middle house. Now, why is this significant? Because what ends up happening is this house here is a Beit Sha'ar. This house becomes a passageway for transporting the Eruv to the middle house. So therefore the residents of this house don't have to contribute to the Eruv anything because they're serving already. Their service is at their passageway.
But wait, they said this doesn't open to anyone. How can it be a passageway?
Between them. No, this one is a passageway.
Right, but it doesn't...
This isn't. This one. This one is a passageway.
But it's not a passageway because...
Why not? I'm not walking through it to get here?
Because there's only one door.
Yeah, but I'm walking through it to get here. To bring the Eruv to here. To the middle one.
Why?
There are three houses.
Okay, so
that's the case. I mean, why? I don't know.
No, but there is a door between this house and
there's a door between them, yeah.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. So I pass through this house to get to the middle house.
Okay.
And I put the Eruv here. So now I made this outer house a passageway. So therefore the people who live here don't have to contribute to the Eruv.
Right.
And I placed it in the middle house.
Okay.
And wherever the Eruv is placed, the people who live in that house don't have to contribute either. So they both are getting it for free. only this guy has to contribute because he's not offering any service. So he gives the bread, the guy, he carries it through this house and he leaves it in this house. The person who lives in Chatzer number 1, he gives the bread, carries it through this house, so therefore this house, house A, let's say, is being used as a passageway, and he also deposits it in house B.
Okay.
So house B benefits from both of the Eruvei Chatzerot. He can carry in both of the Chatzerot.
Right.
And these two houses benefit because since they were used as passageways for transporting the combined Eruv, they are both exempt from contributing to the Eruv. And the middle house, since it's the place where the Eruv is,
the question is,
exempt.
all can carry this Eruv?
And everyone can carry there, but only 2 people had to pay for everybody. So the Parsim are going to live in the middle of the house.
Outsiders.
They're going to live in the middle of the house, because they don't have to pay. So so that's how it's going to work. So they come in the middle of the house. Now, so the chidush is that now why is it that the house where you place the eruv never has to contribute? Because the whole concept of placing the eruv in one house is to say that this is our residence. So the people who actually live there, they don't have to do that. So it ends up that one person pays for the eruv of Chatzer number 1, and one person pays for the eruv of number 2, and 5 houses are benefiting. 5 houses benefit. Okay, now,
If somebody eats the eruv, does the eruv collapse?
No, once Shabbat starts,
Yeah, you can eat the eruv, no problem.
they could eat it. Yeah.
Okay.
In fact, they did. So, Badik lehu Rechava l'Rabbanan. Rechava used to test the rabbis with cases, and he asked them the following case: Shte chatzerot u'shte batim benehem. Let's downsize the case a little bit, and let's make it that you have only 2. There are only 2 houses here instead of 3. Okay, one house A adjoins courtyard number 1. House B adjoins courtyard number 2. Okay. Now here it's even more complicated. So now zeh baderech zeh v'natan eruvo bazeh v'zeh baderech zeh v'natan eruvo bazeh kanu eruv olo. So mi mashvet lehu legabe dahai bayit ulegabe dahai bet sha'ar ulegabe dahai bet sha'ar ulegabe dahai bayit. So the issue is that what could you do? You could do as follows: that the person from Chatzer number 1, okay, he walks through house A and puts it in house B.
Yeah.
The person in Chatzer number 2 walks through house B and he puts it in house A. So they crossed. Okay. Now what ends up happening is the person in Chatzer number 2 is considering house B his bet sha'ar, his passageway,
right,
and house A is his house, because that's where he puts it. The person in Chatzer number 1 considers house A his passageway, and house B is his house, because that's where he's putting it, right? Now the problem is, so from Chatzer number 1's perspective, A is a passageway and B is a house. From Chatzer number 2's perspective, A is a house and B is a passageway. Is that okay? Is that kasher?
Well, we do the same thing when...
Because there, house A is only a passageway for Chatzer Aleph, for Chatzer number 1.
Interchangeable.
Right, and everyone's agreeing that house B is the house that we're resting the eruv. Right, because house A is a passageway for the left. House B is house C is a passageway for the right. But here you're using the same 2 chatzerot, and from one perspective making it passageway house, and from the other one making it house passageway. So can you do that? So Amruleh, they said to him, Shenehen lo kanu eruv. It's no good. It's no good at all. Why? Because manafshach. If you're going to call this a passageway, you can't put an eruv into a passageway. It has to be in a house. You can't put it in a passageway. You can't put it in achsadra, which is like this portico, this outdoor portico, and you can't put it on the mirpeset, this kind of porch. You can't do that. Eno eruv. And if you're going to consider it a house, then you're carrying through a house that isn't part of the eruv. Because if the person in Chatzer number 1, let's say, carries through house A to put it in house B, okay, but if that house B is considered to be the house, okay, so then the problem is, then house A is considered to be a passageway, right? So there's something separating him from where he's putting the eruv and his actual chatzer. Okay? So,
gap.
in other words, there's a gap because you're calling them both a bayit and both a bit sha'ar.
Right.
So you have a problem because either you're putting it in a bit sha'ar or there's a gap.
There's a gap in time.
Right? Or there's a gap in between. So it's not going to work. Because if you're going to call it a passageway, then you're calling the other thing a house. And if you're calling it a house, you're calling the other thing a passageway. You can't have both. Because either way, you're either putting the eruv in a passageway, or you're putting the eruv in a house that's separate from where you are, from your actual chater. So that's no good. Either way, it's no good. So they said to him, "Umayishna midiravna." What about the case of midirava? What about the case of Rava? Because le'ahad, so he said, the Amar Rava says, the Amrulo Shinaim, two people said to him, Seva Arev Alenu, le'ahad Erev Alav mi ba'odyom, le'ahad Erev Alav ben HaShemashot. This is talking about Eruvei Techumin. Zesh Erev Alav mi ba'odyom nechal Eruvo ben HaShemashot, v'zesh Erev Alav ben HaShemashot nechal Eruvo mishetech shach, shenehem kanu Eruv. That we have a case where, let's say you made a messenger, and one guy gives the messenger's Eruv, and he makes the Eruv before nightfall, before sunset. And for the other guy, he makes the eruv after sunset, but before the stars come out, during Ben HaShemashot. The one that was made before nightfall, in other words, when it was still daytime, got eaten during Ben HaShemashot. And the one that was made during Ben HaShemashot got eaten after dark. Okay? So what do we do with these eruvim? So both of them have a problem. One of them got eaten before it was definitely nighttime, so we don't know if it ever took effect, because it got eaten. We know it was placed before nighttime, but we don't know if it still was intact at nighttime. And the other one was placed during Ben HaShemashot, so we don't know if it was even set up by day or not. So we said Shnehem, both of them are good, because both are a Safek D'Rabanan. Safek D'Rabanan the Kula. We say that, okay, for the one that was placed before sunset and only lasted until Ben HaShemashot, we're going to say that Ben HaShemashot is nighttime. And for the one that was placed during Ben HaShemashot and lasted until nightfall, we're going to say Ben HaShemashot is daytime, because it's rabbinic, so we'll be lenient. So he said, why is that any different? Here we'll say, from the perspective, since it's only rabbinic, we'll say, okay, for courtyard number one, we're going to say that where it is a house, and the intervening house is just a passageway. And for courtyard number two, we're going to say that the place, that the house that's further away from it is the house, and the intervening thing is just a passageway. Why do we have to say they're both houses and both passageways at the same time? Why can't we just pick for each perspective? Make it dependent on perspective. And say it's a doubt from either vantage point. So he answers him, no, hachiyash, that's not comparable, because hatam safek yamama safek lilya lo min kira milta. Because there it's a safek yom safek laila. It's a doubt about whether it's day or night. It's not a clear thing. It's not a definitional thing. We don't have a definition that we're saying this house is a house and also a beit sha'ar.
He's saying you can't.
We're not giving it two definitions.
Right. You
In each case, we're saying we don't know. Right? But you're saying give it two definitions. We're not giving it two definitions. We're saying we don't know whether it's day or night, so we're going to have to go with we'll go with the lenient conclusion, and in another case we'll go with a lenient conclusion. But we're not saying this time is definitely day, this time is also definitely night. That would be wrong. That wouldn't work. However, here you're saying aval hacha id legabe dehai bayit legabe dehai bayit I legabe dehai bet sha'ar legabe dehai nami bet sha'ar. But here you have to assign it a definition. You can't say this is both a house and a gateway. It doesn't work. So if from one perspective it's a house, it's got to be a house from the other perspective. If it's a gateway from the one perspective, it's a gateway from the other perspective. So you can't have your cake and eat it too. So therefore, since the two definitions are going to cancel each other out, basically, because if you're making them both a house, okay, then what ends up happening is there's a space between each eruv and its respective courtyard. Okay? And if you're going to make each one a beit sha'ar, if you're going to make it a gateway, then one courtyard is placing its eruv in the beit sha'ar.
Why that would be a problem, because the people of this house, if you make it that way, can actually walk to this house, and then and then they wouldn't be able to carry this way. In which case, that would still prohibit carrying in this direction for the people of this house. If they were invited here
right.
for Shabbat, right? they wouldn't be able to go through here because for them, this house is
It's part of the other Eruvin.
It's part of the other Eruvin, exactly.
Right, it's because
And
it's
therefore
two
they wouldn't be able to carry
because it's
this
two
way.
separate Eruvin.
So it doesn't
Right.
make it.
It's another issue. Right, that would be another issue. Right. So Hadran ala Hadar, Hadran ala Hadar, Hadran ala Hadar. So we conclude Hadar. And by the way, Rashi says that the reason why we're concerned with these sfekot is because it makes the rabbinic laws look silly. In other words, with Safek Yom, Safek Laila, people understand it's an intrinsic doubt. We don't know. We can make different decisions. It's not obvious. But here it's called Chochav Itlula. It's called it's a making fun because people will joke about it. They'll say, "Oh, you're making this whatever you want. Oh, it's a house. It's a bichar. It's a house and a bichar. It's a house for him. It's bichar for him, and it's it's whatever you want." So it looks arbitrary, and it makes people lose their faith in the halachot d'Rabbanan.